Hey everyone, thank you for your introduction.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely.
Our second panelist is Jen Lennon, who currently works as the Arts Integration Instructional Specialist for Colorado Springs School District 11. She is an educator and performer specializing in music and drama who has spent almost 30 years integrating the arts into classroom curricula. She has taught all grade levels, preschool through college, in a career that has taken her from Chicago to Toronto and eventually to Colorado Springs. Jen is a passionate advocate for student voice and accessibility through the creative process. As a teacher, she believes her role is to foster an environment in which every student can share their unique story and perspective in developing a deeper and relevant understanding of the world around them. Jen is grateful for the opportunity to mentor other educators in this pursuit, as well as connect with arts organizations to create collaborative partners. In addition, Jen still maintains her own artistic voice as a musical theater and TYA performer. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you. Very excited to be part of this conversation today. Thank you, Alie.
And our third panelist is Edrick Rhodes. Edrick has 24 years of experience in education, designing and delivering standards-based curriculum in arts education. He is an advocate for equity and access in arts education for all students and adult learners. Currently, Edrick serves as the Education Director of Curriculum and Administration, providing strategic teaching strategies for local and national programming for the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. Recently, Edrick served as the Senior Administrator of Arts Integration Strategic Initiatives, providing strategic oversight for K-12 arts curriculum and grant administration for the 10th largest school district of Palm Beach County, Florida. There, Edrick led curriculum-based learning for 193,000 students and professional development for school-based leaders and arts educators of 180 schools. Edrick also works as an adjunct music professor, national clinician, music adjudicator, and conductor. Aside from his work, Edrick has an amazing wife and a 1-year-old son. Thank you, Edrick. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being here.
Absolutely. And thank you all for gathering with me. I've been so grateful to work and collaborate with each of you in various capacities. And I'm honored to be able to bring us all together to discuss such a meaningful topic that supports our students and our communities through the arts. Just logistically, we'll spend about 40 minutes talking together, and then we'll take time at the end to field questions from the audience. So for those watching from home, you can input questions into the Q&A, and we'll address as many of those questions at the end as we can. But let's set the stage and open up the conversation a bit. The four of us came together to think about and share where we are now and what the future holds for arts education from our various perspectives. So we'll start with where we are now, and we'll break those down in a few different ways. Edrick, I'd like to start with you. You've been working with teachers and administrators supporting engagements in the arts for the past 20 plus years. Can you speak a little bit about trends that you've seen emerge in arts education and what that landscape has presented for us today?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And I'm going to start with the landscape first. The current landscape of newly appointed superintendents and principals are happening at an incredible pace across the country. Unfortunately, that leads to a lack of depth of knowledge for anyone to speak at the upper leadership level who can truly speak for the impact of arts in their community schools and school districts oftentimes. This landscape of new hires and new vision and mission statements and oftentimes strategic planning tends to start to change, as we see nowadays with things happening in our country. So therefore, I think the trend has promoted the arts teachers and stakeholders to be the biggest advocates and cheerleaders for their programs. This is a time not to be modest, but to really, really, be that voice, if you will, and promote the amazing work that students are doing in their classrooms and as often as possible, so we can embed the arts into the language of revising new strategic plannings and visions and mission statements. And again, in closing, I think we have to remember, no one's going to tell our story about our students and their dedication better than you. And that's really critical.
I couldn't agree more. I love what you said about be that voice, right? Take action. And that's really what we're here talking about today, right? How can we move that needle forward and continue to do that work to pave that landscape?
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And Jameel, feel free to add on to that as well, but you've also been involved with the arts in an amalgam of capacities over the years. Can you speak a little bit about your experiences and trends that you've seen persist within the visual arts and education?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Alie. And thank you, Edrick, for your contribution to this conversation as well. So yes, I have worked in art education for 10 years now, and I've taught in various capacities and at all grade levels. I've taught in community programs such as Upward Bound and Boys and Girls Club. I've been a paraprofessional with the public school system in Columbus, Ohio. Um, I have taught as a graduate teaching assistant at R1 University and now at Colorado College. And I can say that my experiences have changed in all of those different capacities and with each of those different experiences. Um, I think the the experiences that I've had in low income areas and areas that are primarily Black and Brown, I've seen an underfunding or defunding of arts education and a replacement of that with sort of private sector solutions, nonprofit solutions, um, and the more that the, the more I go sort of higher in that hierarchy. Now I'm at Colorado Springs, which is as far away from the Upward Bound and Boys and Girls Club experiences of Columbus, Ohio. Um, See a lot more enfranchisement of students and a lot more emphasis on the transformative and liberating aspects of the arts. Um, I've also seen a lot of resilience and a lot of brilliance across all levels. So even while arts are undervalued and underfunded in low income public school systems and low income areas, I still see the creative spirit, the creative brilliance, the creative potentials and activities of students. Um, and I can attest to just how transformative and liberative um, engaging in the arts and giving people access to creative expression can be. So I would like to see us bridge that gap of bringing the kind of respect and admiration for the arts for the arts and creative thinking. Because really, when we talk about the potentials of art education and the value of art education, it's not just restricted to the visual arts or music, but it extends to theater, dance, poetry. Um, I would like to see us bridge that gap of providing the same sort of access, funding, and resources that our students have here at CC to all people from all walks of life and all socio and economic backgrounds.
Excellent. Yeah. And so grateful for the work that you've done and continue to do within that work. And what I heard a lot of you saying is how do we increase access, but also prove value into what the arts can provide. So much in my role in education at the FAC Museum, I encounter so many people who are like, I'm not an artist, or, I don't know how to do this. I don't know much about the arts. And the way that we express ourselves comes through in so many different ways. And helping situate that for our students is so important that they feel that they can embrace that creative spirit like you talked about. And Jen, this seems really prevalent to the work that you do with our local school district, Colorado Springs District 11. Can you think about some of these concepts that Edrick and Jameel have brought up and how you're seeing them present themselves at School District 11, or how you might want to see those things continue through School District 11?
Yes, well, thank you, Edrick and Jameel, for those perspectives. And I think in listening to you, I really think they're tied together, right? Edrick, as you said, new leadership, folks are reimagining mission statements, goals for school districts. And I think, like you said, we need to be the voice, but if we can provide a new lens for some of these phrases that we're hearing. I know in District 11, we have what we call our graduate profile for personalized learning. So it talks about things like innovative thinking, problem solvers, critical thinkers, empowered citizens, collaborative spirit. All of those things are what the arts bring us. So I think in shouting loudly from our platform, what we can do is connect those ideas, provide that lens for those leaders to know that what they're asking for is what the arts provides. So we're not that far away. And I think as you're addressing, Jameel, the value of the creative process. And again, as arts advocates, connecting those dots for folks around us, because as artists, we know what the creative process looks like. It's reflection, it's evaluation, it's revision, it's collaboration, it's all of those skills that we know young people need. So if we can connect the dots and connect that to math and science, right? Connect that to the STEM initiatives and the idea that great science comes from the creative process, just like great art comes from the creative process. So I think in being advocates, we need to tie those things together very clearly, make those connections. I think sometimes we know something so deeply in our hearts that we forget to articulate it for others, perhaps, who I believe know it, but they may have forgotten, because all of those leaders were once children moving around their yards, skipping around their cities, singing songs, participating in cultural forms of celebrations. They all know it. They just might not see it when we get into that intellectual setting and we start applying all these larger principles. So I think it's just a reminder that all of this is connected to the human experience. And if we can provide that lens for our leaders and connect it to the creative process, I think that will benefit all school districts. So that's my goal. And I think that District 11 is responsive to that. And I hope other districts are as well.
Absolutely. That support of not just educating our students, but helping everyone understand the presence and the value of the arts in all entities of what they're doing. And Jen, I'd love to go back to you for you to talk a little bit about some of those distinguishing factors. We think about arts instruction, arts integration, arts enhancement. I know a lot of people who think those are all the same thing that we do. Would you mind talking about what those various forms are and how those look for you?
Sure, I'd love to, because I think this is something that even as a practitioner 30 years ago, I'm not sure I really understood the distinction myself. I just went on instinct. But we really have three categories when we're talking about arts education. There's arts education for the sake of the art form. That's what most of us think about. That's going to music class, going to art class. Unfortunately, most young people don't get to go to dance or drama class, but hopefully we're changing that. Then there's arts enhancement. That's sort of what I was referencing a moment ago. It's how we might have learned our ABCs, or how we perhaps sketched pictures for vocabulary words or all those mnemonic devices. It's using the art form to help support another subject. But then the third piece, arts integration, is exactly what it says. It's making sure that we're integrating both subjects. So if we're learning about the water cycle and dance at the same time, and energy and space, we're making sure we honor the elements of dance and that we're being very overt about learning the skills involved in dance as well as the skills involved in science. And so I think a lot of educators think arts integration is an extra thing and an and thing, and it's really not. It's just, again, your lens, it's your perspective, it's your approach to how you're teaching it. And unfortunately, I think most of us in our brains have compartmentalized the arts. Because as Sir Ken Robinson well articulated, the industrialization of education created this idea that things belonged in boxes. And so when most of us think of arts, we think of that art class that we went to. And for some folks, that may not have been a comfortable experience. So I think breaking down those compartments, avoiding compartmentalizing and getting to intersectionality, getting back to where everything connects, that's how our brain works. And so that's where truly it would be lovely if we could see more of us on that arts integration end. Of course, I'll always advocate for art's sake. Absolutely, 100%, because the arts are essential. And I would advocate for all arts forms, no matter what your zip code is, as Jameel was referencing, that every student get exposure to all art forms. Enhancement, I'm never going to stop anyone from singing and dancing in class. Go for it, draw away. But if we can really root into the integration, I think we will deepen learning, we will make learning more relevant, and then it sticks, learning that sticks. So that's sort of the breakdown, and that's the direction that we're moving. I mean, that's in my title, and I'm grateful for that, that I get to think about that all day long, every day.
And might I add to that? I mean, that's great, Jen. Everything you were saying was spot on. Research has proved that the benefits of arts integration through students' abilities to retain new concepts and information for them to have for it to stick for longer periods of time. I also like to say, and I mention this to principals all the time, that arts integration permits a deeper understanding of academic content, which leads to deeper and sustained learning. And I think if we continue to speak that language across the country, as in the fields of arts management and arts education, to our stakeholders in leadership, I think it will be more accepted. I think sometimes people feel like there's a fear of, oh, we got to change the curriculum. And this is not a change in curriculum. We're just talking about adding other strategies to deepen learning.
And if I may add to to what you were saying, Edrick, um, I I've recently been reading this book by a physicist named Stefan Alexander called "Fear of a Black Universe," and he's a PhD has a PhD in physics, and also is a practicing jazz musician. And in the book, he talks about how in order to sort of understand physics problems, he approaches it like a musician and taps into his intuition and improvisational sense. And in that way, these two fields are in conversation with each other, and uh, one helps enhance the understanding of the other. Um, in a way that, if you were just thinking through one field and thinking through another field, they wouldn't necessarily be in conversation, and his understanding of it wouldn't be as deepened. And from a sort of cognitive perspective, being able to approach a problem from multiple different angles and multiple different perspectives actually strengthens and enhances our neural networks, so that when we're thinking through a problem, we're not just going through one logical path, but we're able to attack it from different angles. So yeah, just as somebody who's been recently reading the book where this person is like clearly going through this process, yeah, very inspired by what both of you are saying.
Yeah, that ability to create applicability for learners as well, to see the reasons in which they're connecting in that way. It's interesting, Jameel, that you brought up this convergence of science and the arts together. I'm thinking back to some of my graduate work that I did, and one of our classes was co-taught by a Black Studies professor who specialized in music and another professor who specialized in science history. And to have them co-teaching this class together and thinking about, okay, what does this mean for education and how do we merge these pieces together, was incredibly meaningful, because it pushed us all to think outside of our content areas and outside of the classroom, and how do we help connect these things for our students. It was challenging, though, I think, for some of the students in our class to say, we're learning about education. Why is there science that's here? How does that fit into what we're doing if I'm not a science teacher? And so that brings me up to a question that we've kind of picked at a little bit, but how can teachers and administrators help support these modes of arts education within their schools? And I think you all have some experience within this, but feel free to jump in, whoever wants to chat about that, of how do we help support teachers and administrators in communicating that value that you all have laid out.
What I'll jump in briefly, and say one of the ways that, speaking from the perspective of the lack of education in this area, or speaking from the perspective of communities who have experienced this lack of education, I think administrators and superintendents can, I think, one, they should read Eddie Glaude Jr.'s Democracy in Black and familiarize themselves with the concept of the value gap. And really sit with the implications of what that means. So in that book, um, Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. talks about the value gap being an expression of what and who a society chooses to place value in. And so, on one hand, that's a class critique, um, speaking specifically about politics in America. There is a particular um, lack of value that's placed on low income people who come from a unskilled labor background. Um, but then there's also a racial and a gender aspect of that as well. Um, and then that gets when we think about it in terms of the disciplines and the hierarchy of the disciplines, um, that gets replicated and reproduced in terms of you know the the value that's placed on math, science, um, and chemistry, those fields, um, they get privileged a lot more than art, music, dance, and even within the arts, craft, things like weaving, crocheting, embroidery, like those are not considered part of the fine arts, and so they're left completely out of the discourse. Um, and in terms of how that value gap is expressed in our policies toward people and communities, there's a sense of, this school is underperforming on standardized tests, so they don't deserve, you know, the funding to hire an art teacher. So instead, we're gonna, you know, either let that school not have a creative curriculum, or we'll give a pittance of that funding so that they can pay a nonprofit organization to come in once a month, um, and work with a select few students. Um, so I think, wrestling with who we place value in, what we place value in, and why we do that, and having an honest, like road to Damascus moment of, how am I, a part of a system of oppression and a system of exploitation, and you know, uh, choosing otherwise if we want to create a society that's respectful and enfranchising of all people.
I'll go ahead and add to that. Teachers and administrators, that is, they both have an agreement that we need support of students with backgrounds with trauma. And I think we know that the arts and arts integration strategies give students an opportunity to create an emotional release. And Jen was mentioning earlier about the arts, collaboration. That's a key word. I believe collaboration between administrators and teachers is critical, and working together to create cultivating professional development through professional learning communities is essential, both for the teachers, practical teachers, and for administration.
And I'm going to take a different lens on this, a different shift too, that I agree with everything Jameel and Edrick have said. But when it comes down to that individual teacher level, I think just encouraging teachers to be bold, to find courage. And so to give them the support and the space to do that, because teachers are incredible people, and to give them some breath to look and maybe look at their own practice and how they might evolve in education. And I think giving them space to tap into their own creativity. I think that if we can provide opportunities in these professional developments that Edrick was referencing to celebrate the teacher as a human and as a person, that will remind them that they have a classroom full of creative humans that are just a little bit younger than them, not quite far along on the path as they are. And I think that there's an energy to that. I know that that sounds really ethereal and out there. And of course, you don't want to just have one of those amazing workshops and then go back and for, the notes stay in a pile somewhere. But that's where, if we can have those moments to re-energize teachers in their own creative celebration, I believe that one teacher at a time, one classroom at a time, we can encourage teachers to be bold and to support that in their own rooms. And I do believe that that is powerful.
It is, and I'm kind of grappling within my head of how do we do that and what does that look like? Because there are a lot of things that are standing in the way of that happening, right? And so when we think about policy and funding and standardized tests like Edrick you mentioned, and teacher evaluations, growth scores, these are all things that I've lived through in my career, and it feels somewhat harnessing a little bit. Like you don't have that space, or you don't always have that freedom because of this cycle that what you are doing in your classroom is tied to the way that your students perform on a very specific, frankly, oppressive test, right? And so how then do we start to break those things down? And so thinking from a policy level, what are some of those, what kinds of approaches can we take from that standpoint to help release some of that pressure that teachers are fighting a battle, right, against something to create for their students? And Jameel, you'd mentioned when we spoken before, this was an area of particular interest for you as well. So I'd love for you to hop in and talk about this.
Yeah. I think we've gotten to a point where standardized tests have really done a lot of harm to the way that we educate, particularly in high school, K through 12 education. So when I was a AmeriCorps paraprofessional in Columbus Public Schools, it was a low performing school, so there was a lot of anxiety around funding and around student performance. So there was this anxiety that produced moments where the principal would come into a classroom and say, all right, you need to stop the lesson that you're doing because we need to work on the writing portion of this test. Or, we took this practice test for, the end of year high stakes assessment. We scored really low on this portion, and so we need to focus on this portion for the next, couple of weeks. And I realized that that could be one principal's response um, to the anxieties of being in charge of this place. But I also, I have my father has been a teacher, a public school teacher for 30 years, and that's been his experience as well. My mother does research work on the public school system and the disparate racial outcomes because of that, and it seems to be a systemic issue where, you know, middle to upper class affluent school districts don't have the same kind of pressure to perform, in part because of their cultural capital and their social capital and their access to parents who have had college education and advanced degrees. Um, but standardized tests have become much more punitive for too many school districts and not really evaluative. So I think if we and I think it's worth it to acknowledge and realize the fact that this is a fairly recent phenomenon. It's really since the Bush era of No Child Left Behind, which then gets expanded in the Obama administration's race to the top. These are policies that have a life, a shelf life within the last couple of decades. It hasn't been this way for the entire life cycle of American public education. So I think if we had the courage to honestly appraise, what high stakes assessment is actually doing, um, and the kind of outcomes that it's producing, then I think we could muster up the political courage to create new policies that won't be that won't hold school districts hostage to how they perform on a high stakes assessment, and give teachers more space and more breath to actually be creative and uh, you know comfortable in a classroom and see their students and enfranchise their students, as opposed to like trying to coerce them to be a model student so that they can perform well.
And to have the space to take risks, right?
Yeah.
Because how can we expect our students to take risks when we as educators don't feel that we have the space to do the same, right? So having that grace of, hey, you can try something and maybe it doesn't go the exact way that you thought, but what kind of impact did that carry for the students who are engaging in that? And just those as the important components to that. But curious as well about other thoughts you have about policy changes, or how has policy impacted the arts in our schools?
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in. I'm torn because while I'm not in favor of this, I will say that oftentimes upper leadership, district offices do look at standardized tests as a measuring stick for funding and what have you. And we know that's that's wrong on many levels. However, though, for the arts to gain some attention from people who are maybe not arts, supporters, there has to be some sort of acknowledgement. And I know there are some school districts that have implemented EOCs for the arts. And while that's we cringe a little bit on that, I do think we have to move into a direction of some sort of end of the year exam, some kind of rubric based criteria to show that we do have value. Oftentimes coming from me being a former high school band director, I would go to my district evaluations and I would go to state evaluations, and there really wasn't a connect when I brought those rating sheets home, home meeting the school to my administration. They thought a job well done. And yeah, they would implement that in my evaluation, but they really didn't understand that rubric. And so somehow or another, I think the future of funding of supporting is probably the direction of we need to create some sort of our own rubric, not putting it in the hands of someone else who's not understanding how our day-to-day teachings of arts courses are, but some sort of standardized support of testing to show we exist and we take our craft very serious. Again, I know as I say that some people might cringe, but I think if we have control of that and we are hands-on, that will be very helpful to grasp the attention of some major stakeholders.
And to build upon both Edrick and Jameel, what you're talking about, I think another way to do that, to break down that hierarchy, Jameel, of what is important in education, what subjects qualify. I know the state of Colorado has moved into identifying giftedness now in, I believe it's 16 areas. And this is fairly new within the past few years. And it's what you're speaking to, Edrick, creating a rubric. Yes, that you can be gifted in math or writing or reading, but now you can be considered musically gifted. You can be considered gifted in dance. You can be considered gifted in visual art or kinesthetically. And so by having that identifier, then we can fund and support those students. And we have said, yes, being gifted in dance holds just as much weight as being gifted in science. And I think that that's one of the areas, Edrick, where again, we can move within the system to work to have policies in place to support those students. And we recently just hosted one of those gifted scenarios with the Fine Arts Center. And what was exciting is thinking about how do we create markers and qualifiers that aren't pencil and paper for visual artists, for instance, and how do we invite other artists in the community? And that's what's been exciting, is that the folks that are coming in and doing the evaluating, if you will, are artists. And so we make and create together. And so we wanted to have a celebration of dance and creativity. And at the end, some of those students might find themselves being identified, but every student now was engaged in this incredible process, and they were introduced to a place within their community where what they do is valued, and a series of artists and mentors for them that also work in their own fields. And so I think, yes, we were creating a rubric and a policy, but we were also doing something a little bit more in giving them those connections and making them feel very valued for what it is that they love and what they're passionate about.
Yeah, and that was a really interesting process to work through with you, Jen, to think about how do we take away that standardization component of it without feeling like all of this pressure is on you to perform, and just create almost a conference, right? A learning experience, and to see, so much of our FAC staff working with these 6th, 7th, 8th grade students, and just the way that they talk to each other like people with eliminating some of those hierarchies was just an incredible thing to see. And we're grateful to have the space to do that. And I'm curious to think about how do we continue to leverage that work that our teachers are doing or that we're doing within our institutions or our organizations to prove that value. It sometimes feels like we have to prove why the arts are valuable. So how do we do that? And Edrick, I'm going to turn to you first because you had a wonderful example in some of our past conversations about proving that value and leveraging it for good.
Well, it came through. We joke around saying being voluntold for having a Twitter account and just being able to promote the work that we were doing. As I was saying earlier, it was said to me by a superintendent, "No one can tell your story better than you, Edrick." And I was like, that made a huge impact on me. And so what I started doing as an arts administrator was visiting every school and just taking tons of pictures, just all of the work, not of the students, but of the work they're doing. And I was suggesting to our teachers, open a Twitter account. Our district was okay with that. Some districts may not be, but opening up a Twitter account, and it's not about you. It's not your name on the Twitter account. It could be whatever school you're attending, Rainbow Park, music lab, art lab, theater lab. Make it a lab and just start documenting the work and putting it out there so people can see the work that you're doing day to day, because oftentimes that parent or that stakeholder or that administrator can't go into your room. But however, you tweet a picture of something really super cool happening in your classroom, and just one area superintendent likes that, it catches like wildfire. And that's what basically happened for our school district, where we started catching attentions of our area superintendents and superintendent, and everyone started to really build on that positive energy of being telling the story of arts education in our district. And it was being retweeted by our school district, and I think it really made a huge impact to the point where we were building our leadership was building a proposal to the county for a penny referendum. And through that work, that referendum passed, and we was able to change the whole mindset of arts education, where the per pupil for elementary went from $1 to up to $5. And this is where we're talking about impact, making sure the grassroots, starting at the elementary, but the per pupil, that was impactful. But I think it was a testament for our teachers getting out there and buying into the idea of telling the story, being a cheerleader, and being, the biggest advocate for our classes. I think that's what we talk about, being impactful and empowering. How can you take control of your powers that be that you can control? And I think that's really, really powerful if we can start telling those stories through social medias and just highlighting all the greatness that's happening, because the kids are doing it and the teachers are doing the work.
And I think there's even another layer to that, Edrick, telling each teacher's story, because they're doing incredible things. But then the other layer of that is centering the student story then, and the student voice within that sharing. And I think that that's something that stakeholders, leaders, really need to get that insight, is if we center the students in that storytelling then as well, they really get to begin to see the perspectives, and students really feel like their voice and their story in their room, whether they're 7 or 17, matters, and there's a place for them to have space to tell their story. And that's what's so exciting about the possibilities of media in the age that we're in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that element of visibility, right? How do we promote consistent visibility in the impact that the arts have for our students and for our communities? And the more that we do that, the more comfortable people are going to become. And then you see that kind of trickle in, right? Funding comes from there, policy change comes from there, communities start to reshape and to build in new ways. Yeah, that element of visibility, and I've heard that word come up a lot, right? Empowerment. How do we empower the people doing this work to do so, right? And Jameel, this is something you're really passionate about as well, right? How do we use the arts to empower students, and then to take that work and extend that into our communities? What does that look like from your experience in the past?
Yeah. I come from a community in New Orleans where we're all empowered as artists. Not all of us, but it's creative expression is a part of the way of life. So, the part of New Orleans that my family is from, every Sunday there's a second line where a jazz band will play music in the neighborhood and make a procession around the neighborhood, or a church will hire them to walk around the church. And in these moments, in these rituals, you'll see people from the community come out and dance, or they'll come out with their instruments. Somebody play a tambourine, somebody play a trumpet. Um, and so I come from a place where that sort of organic culture is very like empowering and life sustaining for people. Um, Also, on a brief note on that visibility of the arts and demonstrating the value of it, makes me think about the Art on the Streets initiative here in Colorado Springs. That's such a wonderful program and a wonderful policy to support local artists, to bring to make the arts more visible, um, in in the community. And I think if we had more programs like that, um, nationwide, um, that would be a powerful way to demonstrate the value of the arts. Um, when I think about empowerment, also I think about how education, particularly arts education, but education more broadly, um, is really a process of socialization and identity formation. Um, and so, in my role as an educator, I try to be mindful of presenting multiple narratives, um, through which students can see themselves in the history of art, so that students don't, you know, so that students feel empowered when they're in the classroom, and and can see that their work, their experience, their identity, um, is valuable, is important, that they don't have to, fragment parts of who they are and only bring a section of who they are to class, but they can bring all of themselves to class. Um, as a teacher, I realized the inherent power dynamic, between me as a teacher and the student, and I try to use that awareness to democratize the power in the classroom, so that students feel like we're in this space in a context of mutual respect, shared ownership. So I invite students to sort of co-curate the class with me. I'm always asking for their input. I plan things like rest, space, um, exploration. I plan out votes and aspects of the class that are contingent upon student input, so that they have a direct influence on how the day goes and how the semester or the block goes. Um, yeah, so those are some of the ways that I approach that idea of empowerment.
I think educationally, the phrase that's been used about the past 10 years is mirrors and windows. And the idea that in a classroom, there should always be an opportunity for a child to see themselves reflected in an activity as in a mirror, but for another child to see that activity as insightful as if they're looking through a window. And I think one thing I try to do is to ask myself, am I always presenting the same mirror? Am I always presenting mirrors to only a certain segment of students, and the rest of the students are asked to be looking through the window the whole time? And if that's the case, then I need to shift. And that's what you're talking about, Jameel, I think. It's just another metaphor for that, is to make sure that in our rooms, everyone's perspective is considered equal. And so that we're offering mirrors, not just on special days or special holidays that occur, but that we're equally offering mirrors. And if we're not sure if we are, then inviting the class to be fully themselves, like you said, Jameel, and not having to code switch from location to location or group of people to group of people. And that's a very self-reflective thing that teachers have to ask themselves, because I have biases, I have implicit things. And again, if we lean into each other, that collaborative piece that you were talking about, Edrick, and we lean into our institutions that surround us and our arts organizations, I know that I'm very passionate about that, not leading into them to come and helicopter something in and drop it on us, but to provide those resources and those supports, so that if I'm not sure how to offer more mirrors in my room, that I can learn as well, from those around me.
I love that metaphor, and I'm surprised I have not heard that one before, but windows and mirrors.
I can't take credit for it. It's been in education for a while.
Thank you for sharing that, and sorry to cut you off, Edrick, but please continue.
No, I think I agree with both what Jen and Jameel, I'm sorry, is saying, because this is critical times of empowerment. I remember one time sitting in my band room at the beginning of the day, the morning, and the bell rung, and all the kids was coming, going to class, and one kid came to my desk and said, "Mr. Rhodes, you are the luckiest person in the world." And I'm like, "Okay, why is that?" He said, "You get to be in the band room all day long." And you think about this. I mean, every school, before the bell rings, all the chorus kids are hanging out in the chorus room. All the band kids are hanging out in the band room. All the visual art kids are hanging out in the art room. What other rooms are they hanging out in but with us? We're all getting that pass in the middle of the day. "Oh, I'm done with my work. I'm coming to the class to hang out." What are you missing? They're just coming because they feel like they're going to miss something. And I realized when that student said that, I was like, "Okay, go to class." But I reflected and was like, "Man, he really wants to be with me. He wants to be here. This is the cool place. This is where they feel most safe. This is where they feel they can be themselves and be accepting and know that we're going to protect them more than anyone else on that campus." So that alone is empowering. And I think that happens at the elementary level, middle school level, collegiate level. I'm an adjunct professor, and I've had students come in 15 minutes before class and go, "I just want to come here and get some work done and just listen to some music," and just they feel safe to be in my classroom, even as an adjunct professor. And we see that across all spans of arts education and what it does. So empowerment is critical.
Absolutely. And you being able to create that safe space where students want to be there, they want to be a part of that. That's an incredible experience to have, right? And just create that connection in different ways and make space for that to happen. And so grateful for all of that work that the three of you are doing to create these spaces. We do have a chat question that came through for us, so I'll pose this. Can you speak to the misconception that many parents have about arts education being only for the students who think this way or want to get into a career in the arts? And Jen, I might ping you on this one first.
Yeah, it goes back to what we were talking about, understanding arts education, arts enhancement, and arts integration. And that, yes, there is an avenue for people who want a career in the arts, but that doesn't mean that the arts are only for them. And I think we've almost done this to ourselves in a way, because we call arts extras and specials and everything else rather than essential and the essence of who we are. So I think it's an open dialogue about how, as human beings, that's how we function. I mean, we literally have a rhythm to us. We can't deny it. It's in our heartbeat. We are designed to move. We are designed to tell stories and interact. So if we can look at the arts less as this hierarchical, this is a fine art and this is what we must learn. But if we look at the arts as the essence of how we exist and how we move and interact and think and create, then it's applicable to every human. I say to every human, you move. Look, I can go to a football game and hear people sing, right? Put some Neil Diamond on and everybody knows the words. Show up at any cultural celebration and there's going to be a dance that occurs. So I think that is one piece of it. And then the other piece of it is tapping back into that creativity cycle and that brain research that Edrick was referencing and that Jameel was talking about with creativity, is that it's all interconnected. That's how our brains work. Our brains do not work by subject matters in 45-minute chunks. So, and like Jameel said, you have, your jazz musician who's also has a PhD. I even think of someone like, rock stars. There's one of the players in Queen is also an astrophysicist. So the idea that these things don't live in isolation. If there's anything I could do, if we look back 1,000 years, people weren't living in isolation with the arts. The arts were how they were carrying on their culture and their lives and their traditions. And so, not that I want to go backwards in time, I want to go forwards and be better about how we do it. Sorry, I get really passionate about questions like that, because I'm so sad when I hear teachers or parents say, "But I'm not artistic." And I'm like, "But you are human." So I'll mute myself now.
No, Jamil said it before earlier that his father was an educator, and I will jump on that bandwagon. My dad was a band director for 30 years. His two brothers are band directors down in South Florida. My brother is a retired band director. I tell people all the time, hey, arts education is a family business.
Yeah, yeah. And briefly, I would say, if I were speaking to those parents, or maybe thinking through the anxiety of those parents, um, one, I would probably imagine that those parents were, they experienced something of what Ken Robinson was saying about anesthetizing themselves, or being anesthetized through their public school education, and probably fed some ideology of, either you're a creative person or you're a logical person. Um, and yeah, Jen, I couldn't say it any better. Like, the arts is how we express ourselves as human beings. Um, and yeah, we can be both. We can be scientists, we can be artists, we can be dancers, we can be craftspeople, we can be farmers, we can be all of that. Um, and yeah, I think the more that we can let these disciplines talk to each other, and break down those distinctions, um, that we would see a cultural and spiritual philosophical renaissance. It would be a beautiful beautiful experience, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It'd be a beautiful world as well, just decompartmentalizing things. We don't need to put things into little boxes and only do them at certain times. They should all be done together and thinking in these unique ways. Um, we only have a few more minutes together, but I would like to ask one question, because I think about, how do we make these things actionable? How can we really implement some things taken from this conversation? But I'd be curious to know from each of you, if there's something that we could implement tomorrow, what might that be for your own context? I don't know if anyone wants to be brave and go first.
Well, I really function at the teacher level, encouraging teachers. So I can't really speak to the hierarchy and policy and things like that. But I think for teachers, just encouraging them to be bold and get a little bit out of their comfort zone. Trust the young people in your room with you to share their perspectives. And it takes some courage. It takes it takes a lot of courage right now to be a teacher, especially in the K-12 system. And so small chunks, do something, one small thing that you might, feel is not totally your forte, that perhaps you're not an expert in, but be willing to try, because your students will see that, and they'll see your nervousness, but maybe your energy, and maybe you fail completely. And if you fail, embrace it. Embrace it and debrief it, and talk with your students and do it again. Create that community that Jameel was talking about, right, in the classroom. And so I know it's so hard. It's been such a hard year for teachers. So for me, if there's one thing I can do today, it's just to come alongside teachers and say, be bold. Let's try something new. What's one thing different you want to try in your classroom? What's a different resource you could bring in? Or what's a different activity we could try that's connected to the arts? And if you haven't danced in your classroom in the last couple of weeks, let's do it. Let's just do it. So that's my answer. It's not very philosophical, but it's just practical.
And I beg to differ. I think being bold, trusting students, having courage, those are philosophies that we can bring into our classroom and inspire for students. So I think it's a lot deeper than you thought. Awesome. Jameel, you unmuted yourself as well. What's something that you're thinking about that we could do tomorrow?
Um, if I'm thinking sort of magically, and I'm someone who came of age, during the Occupy Wall Street movement. So just take it with a grain of salt. But if I could if I could magically implement one thing tomorrow, it would be democratic socialism, because I see that as a political expression of the sort of the idea that everyone's life is valuable, everyone's contribution is valuable in a political sense. That slowly divesting ourselves from the system of capitalism would undo a lot of the damage and a lot of the damaging ideologies that we're forced to live with. So we have this, we have this concept in capitalism of certain trades or certain forms of labor being more valuable than others. In Marxist terms, that would be called socially necessary labor time. So, the reason why a entry level programmer can make, double what an entry level teacher can make is because capitalists deem programming to be socially necessary labor time. Um, the reason why we have this sort of Swiss cheese uh, version of school districts and voting districts is because of a monopoly type of political organization that enfranchises a certain uh, elite and excludes the voices of a lot of other people. So I think if we're able to politically enfranchise people to have equal say and equal power in our political process, that the people themselves would create um, community structures and community institutions that enfranchise themselves. Um, and from that perspective, thinking through arts education as an institution, I would like to see, a reinvestment in things like public libraries, public community centers, public transportation. Um, I think access to creative expression is inhibited by a lot of different things, such as, um, I'm thinking about the fight for $15 an hour, and how that impacts people's ability to have the time to be creative or the time to express themselves and take care of themselves. So, from a political standpoint, I think enfranchising all people in the political process, that would be the change that I would make.
Thank you for that. Yeah, the element, everyone is valuable. Your voice is valuable, and the arts do that for us. They present that. Excellent. Edrick, final thoughts. What can we do?
Arts accessibility for all. And that means elementary, at least weekly arts exposure, teachers, all teachers having arts integrated PLCs, our opportunity for exposure to that, accessibility for that. And again, like I've mentioned earlier, some sort of PLC for administrators on arts education and arts curriculum and what it can mean to be an impact on your students and community, and accessibility for all, every level. That will be my pie in the sky.
And I think that's where we'll leave it. Arts accessibility for all. I want to thank you all so much for joining me in this conversation today. I could talk about this for the next, I don't know, however many hours, and I'm sure our conversations will continue. But I hope those of you that have been watching are thinking about the value and the presence of the arts in our world, not just in a curricular setting, but how we embrace the things that we find meaningful in our lives. And I'm hoping that this conversation will perpetuate the way that we approach arts education for all. Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.